JD Vance has now confirmed that he's looking specifically at Tim Walz, at Ilhan, Omar, and AG Ellison in Minnesota, specific to the fraud investigations and the FBI raids that took place this week. Let's have a listen.
But regardless of whether there was criminal wrongdoing on behalf of the governor, of course, like I said, we're going to let the law make those determinations. We know that he turned a blind eye towards this. I mean, you have people, Will, who came into this country, many of them illegally, and 6 months later they're driving Mercedes despite the fact that they don't have a job. That doesn't happen without some defrauding of the American taxpayer. The fact that they turned a blind eye towards it for so long is a scandal. We're also going to find out whether it was criminal.
So again, JD Vance voiced that Tim Walz is absolutely being looked at the potential fraud and the raids that are taking place. Now, this clip was from early in the year where JD Vance said the same thing. He said that there's no way that the leadership in Minnesota didn't know about this.
I think Tim Walz should resign because it's very clear either that he knew about the fraud in Minneapolis, he knew about the welfare fraud, or at the very least he looked the other way. I think Tim Walz should resign.
So again, looking the other way when there's criminal activity is a crime, especially when you as the governor and your AG, your top law enforcement officer, who is Ellison in Minnesota, are potentially aware of this activity. This is a big deal. Tim Walz is having a really bad day. But let's now get further into this, because where JD Vance goes with this interview by Benny Johnson, I think tells us exactly where he wants to go with the rest of these investigations in Minnesota. Let's have a listen.
People need to see, I think, that the fraud has been laid bare. We've all seen the Learring Center, right?
Correct.
The Learring Center is not an actual daycare.
No.
The Learring Center was fraud, right? And we've seen the hospice fraud in California. So I think it's been demonstrated that this is a problem. What people need to see now is like arrests, right? 100%. Deportations. They need to see that the federal government, the gears of justice grind against these people, and they're not allowed to just continue.
Yes. So let me give you an example, something I just talked about upstairs, but I think it's worth reiterating for your viewers. So you take a program that exists within Medicaid to help autistic children get the resources that they need. So you have a Somalian fraudster in suburban Minneapolis who says that they have 3 kids who are autistic, and maybe they don't even have 3 kids, and they certainly don't have 3 kids who are autistic. So it takes money away from the American citizens who need these services. It defrauds the taxpayer. And you're absolutely right that the thing that we need to do is get real justice. So, you know, something I learned just the past couple of months, I had no idea that we do not prosecute fraud in this country if it's under $1.5 million per year. Okay? So think about that. Think of all the people who are $1.5 million a year. This is not chump change. That is meaningful money. And by the way, sometimes...
So I'm going to jump in here. Again, that number, they don't even blink at 1.5 million. The number that's being looked at as a potential pooling of the fraud, the alleged fraud in Minnesota, is $9 billion. He mentioned California under Gavin Newsom's watch. That's looking at upwards of 80 to 90 billion. That's just as the investigations are starting. So wherever you want to put the floor of where your investigations start, we could agree that it should be $1, right? But the truth of the matter is that these people need to be prosecuted. The American citizens that put Trump and JD Vance back in expect perp walks, expect full and complete restitution where we can have that. The concern that we have is that a corresponding story that we all heard is that there were suitcases of cash being flown out of the Minneapolis airport to Somalia for years under the noses of AG Ellison and Tim Walz. So where is this going? I'm glad that JD Vance is leading this front. I think it's clear that they want to get ahead of this issue. But where you're going to start to see this get really interesting is when they turn to that hospice fraud and other fraud that's happening in California. Because Gavin Newsom, right now, when you look at the recent polls, he is the leading candidate for the Democrats going into 2028. So what should we expect? Clearly, there's mass amounts of fraud that's happening out there, but what we can expect is the Democrats are going to say, see, Donald Trump and JD Vance, they're interfering in our elections. That's going to be their midterm message to 28 message as they get Gavin Newsom warmed up. So what are your thoughts on this alleged fraud that we're seeing? I mean, clearly we're now getting confirmation that Tim Walz is now being actively investigated. Question to you is, should Gavin Newsom be actively investigated as well? I know what my answer is. Curious what your thoughts are in the comments down below. Our very next story is going to be one that you do not want to miss. This is where I break down the more than idea, the reality now that Donald Trump is going to be pulling out of NATO. The questions are, when and what will it look like, NATO look like, or our U.S. strategic relationships once he pulls out? There's no question he's going to do it. I'm going to give you everything that you need to know. The very next story. Have a look.